It took a global pandemic to dramatically reduce school shootings, but sadly, as in class learning has resumed in many parts of the country, so too has the violence. 4 people were injured earlier today after a suspected teen gunman opened fire at Timberview High School, located in Arlington, Texas, about 27 miles southwest of downtown Dallas. The suspect has been identified as 18-year-old Timothy George Sipkins, who fled after the shooting but later turned himself in. He's been charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. This is at least the second school shooting in Texas in less than a week. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, a gun violence prevention organization, there have been more than 100 incidents so far this year in schools nationwide, which have resulted in 21 deaths and 56 injuries. And it may not just be school shootings which are spiraling back up. A rise in gun purchases mixed with pandemic stress may be having a dramatic impact on the country's murder rate. According to a new provisional data from the CDC, the U.S. homicide rate spiked at a startling 30% between 2019 and 2020. The CDC says that's the highest one-year jump in modern history. The previous record was a 20% increase between 2000 and 2001, but that was largely due to the deaths of 9/11. The new data shows that homicides jumped from 5.8 per 1,000 people in 2019 to 7.8 per 1,000 people in 2020. 7.8 is the highest rate since 1995, but the CDC notes that it's still lower than the rate from the early 80s, when homicides averaged more than 10 per 1,000. The new data does not break down how murders were committed, but the CDC does disclose that firearm injury deaths soared 14% from 2019 to 2020. The new data by the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics is consistent with 2020 crime statistics the FBI released last month, which also found a 30% increase in homicides. Joining me now to discuss is the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association, Dr. George Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin, these numbers are absolutely shocking. What do we attribute such a dramatic rise?
You know, our nation is just under tremendous stress. You just think about the fact that we've just had so much anger, so much people not just being civil to one another. You couple that with being cooped up, loss of jobs, loss of opportunity, loss of, one's wealth, and the stress of living today. And it's just a real challenge. And we've got to get back to ways in which we deal with the civility in our nation. Otherwise, we're gonna just kill ourselves to death.
So how does a nation, from a policy perspective, deal with this, what you're describing, which is kind of a collective trauma?
It is really a national post-traumatic stress in many ways, and we've got to first of all deal with a bunch of things. Number one, we got to get back to maintaining order in our society. When you see these kinds of outbreaks that are occurring in town hall meetings and in classrooms and things like that, we've got to first of all bring civil order in those cases. The second thing we need to do, of course, is find ways as a nation to engage people, recognizing that people are under a lot of stress. We need to give them time to decompress. We need to encourage people to seek the mental health that they need, and just the stress counseling that they need. We need to do more of it. And that means both from a policy perspective and a funding perspective, providing more resources for mental health.
So you said in that answer that we need to restore order. How do we do that in a society that is calling for reforming of policing? Some people calling for defunding of policing. What are the mechanisms? Who can we put in those school board meetings? Who can we take to the schools other than flooding those places with officers?
No, first thing we need to do is we need to make sure, when you go into a courtroom, the judge does not take that mess. The judge controls his courtroom, his or her courtroom, no question about that. And if you misbehave in the courtroom, you get put out of the courtroom or you get locked up. I've been a public official on and off through my professional career, and I got to tell you, you can run a meeting. You got to set those standards. You got to hold people to them, and you can't tolerate the kind of nonsense that we're seeing today. That's the first thing we need to do. And the second thing you need to do is,
but of course, the judge has the power of the law on his side. The judge can order you locked up. You know, the person running the PTA meeting or the school board meeting, they don't have that power. So, I mean, there's just a practical problem here. You know, and we even saw that in the tapes, you know, we saw earlier this week, you know, where the insurrectionists were running wild, even before we knew they were running wild in D.C., and the officers were just so overwhelmed, they just said, you know, just let it happen.
Yeah.
I think that at a certain point, people have become overwhelmed, and there's just is not enough of an enforcement mechanism to allow people to get the control that I actually agree with you that we need.
Yeah. Look, I was just in New York, and I just took a picture because I'm going to put it in a PowerPoint slide for presentations. And, you know, there's a law in New York that it's 25 years if you assault a taxi cab driver. Think about that. Now, I'm not encouraging people to give people 25 years, but we do have to put some things in the law to say that you cannot treat school board members disrespectfully. You certainly can't threaten them. You can't tell people, I know where you live. That cannot be tolerated. And particularly doctors and nurses who are, quite frankly, just trying to help people save their lives.
Right. So let's talk about, you know, guns in the mix of all of this. You know, first of all, I always stipulate, and you know, the gun advocates are right in this. Only a tiny fraction of the guns in the U.S. are used to commit violent crimes. But that's because there's almost a gun for every human being in the U.S. So there's just an incredible number of weapons in the country. Yeah. And during the pandemic, we saw a surge in even more buying of weapons. You know, how do we preserve a civil society where we can think about reducing gun violence when we are saturated already, and every time there is some sort of trauma, we see another surge in buying?
Well, let's understand, there is a public health approach to dealing with gun violence. We can make the guns safer. Look, firearms are a tool. We can make them much safer. We have, you know, about 60% of the people who die by firearms because of suicide. And so we can certainly deal again with mental health, but we can make firearms safer. We can make people safer with their firearms, and we can make the environment safer for people and guns in it. So that means criminal background checks. That means closing the gun show loophole. That means using the technological changes that we know exist, so that when you pick up a firearm and you don't know whether it's loaded or not, you have something that can tell you that. There's technology to help you do that. By the way, you can pick up your cell phone, and nobody theoretically can use your cell phone unless they have your palm print, your face print, or you know your code. And yet anybody can pick up a firearm and use it. And yet there's technology that will minimize that ability to do that.
Yeah, but you know, but the one or two gun shops that tried to sell smart guns, you know, they were kind of boycotted and threatened because they tried to sell it. So it's very hard to get those things onto the market.
Absolutely. But the other thing we can do, we can get rid of the bad apple gun dealers. You know, it turns out we know who is selling most of the guns. So I grew up in Chicago, and, you know, you can't buy those guns in Chicago, but you can buy them in the suburbs. And we had to go after those dealers who were selling them. And those guns, by the way, as you know, end up in the black market. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, the guns aren't necessarily being sold in the district. They're being imported in the district. So those are some of the things we got to do. We got to beef up the enforcement of the existing laws that we have to reduce guns that should not be in the hands of people that shouldn't have them.
Yes, sir. Dr. George Benjamin, thank you so much for your time, sir.